Theosophy. This is the first in the Occultism series, and let's start by considering what occultism is, because I think it conjures up ideas of hooded figures hovering over tomes to summon demons, or beakers bubbling with all sorts of peculiar potions, or more increasingly in the modern world, images of elitists at eyes wide shut parties, which I absolutely think are probably genuinely founded, but that's not what occultism is. Let's look at the word itself. It means hidden, and in a previous video I talk about mysticism and how mysticism is sort of an alternative view of a spiritual path that's meant for a handful of people who understand in and out the mainstream perspective on that belief system and are now ready to ascend to study more complex concepts that are reserved for those individuals, not out of some sense of elitism, but simply because if you can't understand the basics inside and out, then you can't understand the more complicated stuff. It's not elitist to teach calculus to college students and not kindergartners. Well, similarly, this is sort of the spiritual equivalent. You're moving on from the basics to a much more complex, nuanced, and substantially less black and white view of things, which parallels the knowledge that we acquire over our lives, I think, very well. So when people say hidden or secret, I think it's easy to misunderstand that as meaning somehow elitist, somehow effete, somehow for people who pay a certain amount or people who belong to certain bloodlines, etc. But really it's more about understanding. And you can really divide occultism into three branches: magic, alchemy, and divination. And that's one thing that differs tremendously, I think, from your standard mysticism. Mysticism is a purely spiritual endeavor, whereas occultism has a lot of materialistic qualifications. It's more about understanding the material world in a spiritual sense so that you can use one to influence the other. In other words, you can use ritual, material things, in order to influence your spiritual progress, but likewise you can also use spiritual behaviors and rituals to influence your material progress. So it's a lot more complicated than just praying for a winning lottery ticket, as you can see. And it absolutely is at odds, no matter who tells you to the contrary, with the modern scientific method, because it does rely on there being a spiritual conception of the universe. And presently, that simply doesn't exist. No matter how much you argue about, with modern physics there are so many things that lend themselves to a spiritual view, it doesn't change the fact that that's not the standard perspective regarding the scientific method. So, by the way, this is not an argument against occultism, nor is it an argument against science. And by the way, it is a coincidence that I'm wearing that t-shirt. So it's not like some little hidden message or anything. But occultism relies on the idea that there are, at least on some level, either gods or angels or other dimensions, which is obviously more secular in its perspective. But there has to be something non-material in order to interact with the material world in some kind of way. Divination is a great example. Predicting the future based on data is not the same thing as divination. Like if I say statistically tomorrow is going to be 75 degrees because if you look at this time zone and you look at this geographical area over the past 10 years, well, that's not divination. On the flip side, if you say, well, I lit a yellow candle in the middle of a meadow at midnight and the flame jumped up more than 3 inches, so tomorrow it's going to be 75 degrees. That's divination. Totally different, as you can see. One is based on data and one is based on ritual. And I think that's an important term when we talk about occultism, because occultism without ritual, at that point it's really more just teenagers. Like, I said that totally wrong, but you know what I mean? Like, if you look at a mainstream and youthful perspective on magic, and I'm not insulting anybody here, but if you look at like 14-year-old Wiccans and stuff, their view on things is significantly different from, say, people who have studied occultism for decades. It's not the same thing. And one of the big differences, I think, is the formality of ritual. Not just because it puts a person in a psychological state where they're more receptive to those sorts of things, but more than anything, I think, because it follows a lengthy tradition that's been handed down since time immemorial. That's huge. You can see this similarly with the overall ambiance and the different aesthetics of older religions and more modern ones. Like, if you compare the Greek Orthodox to the Roman Catholics, the Greeks are much more about old formal rituals. And then likewise, you compare the Roman Catholics to the Anglicans, significant difference in terms of the formality and the age of those rituals. And then if you compare Anglicans to, say, Southern Baptists, I mean, it almost feels like a completely different model of the universe and our place in it. Just the way you feel entering one of the structures created by them. And a lot of that has to do with time. It has to do with the connection between the ancient world and the modern world. And what rituals do is they link those things together. If you're doing something in the exact same manner, with the exact same mentality, in the exact same psychological state as a druid did 3,000 years ago, by the view of an occultist, that would have a dramatically different effect, both in what your intention is and what the actual outcome will be, than, say, somebody who's just sort of, well, I read in Teen Magazine, if you spin around 3 times and say Bloody Mary, it's a different kind of outcome. It's a different kind of view. I know that may sound silly if you're just looking at things purely from a scientific perspective, because results have nothing to do with how old and time-tested an experiment is, for example. It doesn't matter. If you do an experiment from the 19th century and it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And if you try a more modern approach and it does work, then it does work. But with occultism, tradition with a capital T is a very important component of that. Alchemy is a great example of this, because alchemy is a precursor to chemistry, but it's still around, and especially internal alchemy, which I make a previous video on, so I'm not going to go too much in depth on. But you can really see the connection between material and physical with both divination and alchemy, because alchemy is not about just fiddling around with substances. That would be chemistry. It's more about the progress of engaging in these experiments, how they affect you, your progress as a person. That's why so many people don't understand the Philosopher's Stone. They think that it's a physical object, but it's really more about purifying you over time through your devotion to these alchemical processes. Similarly, with divination, sure, at face value, it's about foretelling the future, but it's also about plugging in consciously to the forces that exist that would allow a person to see into the future. And lastly, magic is the most materialistic of all, because it's about engaging in rituals not to understand yourself or the world, but to have a direct impact on any of those processes. In other words, magic seeks to use spiritual rituals to alter the physical world in some way, be it the weather or someone's health or the physical state of an object. That's huge when you really think about it. And you see a lot of more modern interpretations of that. Anytime I talk with someone who believes, what's that called? Like The Secret kind of thing? vision boards and all that. Some people argue that it's just about changing the way you think about something. But changing the way you think about something changes the way you interact with the entire world and the way you operate. If you really think about it, a vision board is nothing more than a more skeptical, modern version of internal alchemy. It is an occult practice. It's very interesting to think that so many of the things that we posit as either New Age or just plain mainstream at this point actually follows along an occult tradition, just in a very less formal, less traditional with a capital T kind of way. So I'm going to elaborate more on these in upcoming episodes, but this was really more just a way so that you can understand what occult means. It means hidden, and it refers to everything I just mentioned. Man, coming up with a synopsis for that's actually harder than I thought. But like, share, subscribe, keep asking questions. Bye.